After an intense manhunt, Dzhokhar Tsarnaev, the youngest suspect in the Boston Marathon bombings, has been formally charged. There will be much debate as we move into the legal phase of this case. So how does our rule of law fit into the modern 21st century battlefield? Joining me now from New York is Andrew McCarthy, former federal prosecutor and New York Times best-selling author. He's also a contributor for PJ Media. Andrew, thanks so much for joining us.
Colonel, a great pleasure to be with you.
Thanks, my friend. Let's talk about the similarities that you can see with this case coming up and the case that you first tried after the World Trade Center attack against the Blind Sheik. What are the similarities you see and some of the things we need to be looking out for?
Well, the big difference, I would say, is that we had no death penalty at the time that that we indicted our case back in 1993. There was a federal court freeze on the death penalty that wasn't really lifted until 1994. So they're likely to have a very different legal terrain in looking at the same kind of a case. The other thing that strikes me is that we had what was clearly a established jihadist cell in New York. We had 12 people at the trial. They're still trying to run down exactly what kind of a jihadist cell there was up in Boston with the Tsarnaevs. Were they, the point people in a bigger network? Was it something much smaller? By the time we got people under arrest, we had, I think, a little bit better idea of what we were dealing with than what they're dealing with up in Boston. But clearly, what both we and they were dealing with is a situation where you've had an atrocious attack involving an indiscriminate mass destruction weapon and a lot of witness testimony from people who were either near or, unfortunately for them, involved in the bombing.
That brings up a great point, because when you look at the whole thing about enemy combatant status and trying him in civilian court, could we have, declared him an enemy combatant for the sake of gathering intelligence and information and then moved on to the civilian court trial? Did we rush into this issue of Miranda rights and seeing him as an American citizen too soon before we got all the questions answered, you believe?
Yeah, I think we did rush to get him into the civilian justice system, although that's really not any surprise for anyone who's been listening to the Obama administration, to the president, and to the attorney general, who are certainly wedded to using the criminal justice system, the ordinary civilian system, for any act of terrorism committed by anyone, certainly within our shores. But I do think that they were entitled to at least a brief amount of time to run down whether this guy is actually connected to the enemy that Congress identified in authorizing military force after the 9/11 attacks. It's clear that there's no legal authority to try this guy by a military commission because he's an American citizen. The Military Commissions Act only permits military commissions for aliens, but that doesn't mean that you can't detain an American who acts with the enemy at wartime, and I think we were entitled to some time to run that down.
Now, you bring up a great point because the authorization of the military force and the military tribunals and the processes and procedures in place. But with this 21st century battlefield, in your estimate or your assessment, do you ever see a time in the future where an American citizen would maybe possibly be tried through the military tribunal system?
I think we're a long way from it, even though it's something that we obviously have to think about. And the reason is, the law has actually been cutting in the other direction. Up until, I would say, about 2004, 2006 really is the big Supreme Court case. Military commissions had a long and illustrious history in the United States going back to George Washington. There wasn't any real legal doubt both that they were legitimate under our Constitution and that the president could unilaterally authorize them and establish them in wartime. It's a very new development in the law that where the Supreme Court decided in 2006 in the Hamdan case that you actually need to have congressional buy-in. And if that remains the law, and there's no reason to think the court is going to reverse itself so soon after that decision, you would have to imagine this Congress being moved to expand military commissions to American citizens. And given the kind of histrionics we had a few weeks back about, drone attacks on American citizens, and, nothing like that had ever happened, but people were pretty whipped up about it. I don't see a lot of appetite in this Congress for expanding military commissions to American citizens.
Good, good. Now, this brings us to an important question, I think, that we fail to understand that this new battlefield does not have borders, it does not have boundaries. When I go back and look at the case of Carlos Bledsoe, who was radicalized out of Memphis, Tennessee, traveled to Yemen and Somalia, came back, shot 2 U.S. soldiers at a Little Rock recruiting station. No one really heard a lot about it. You look at Major Nadal Hassan down at Fort Hood, it's determined and declared as workplace violence. Why do you think there is such a reticence to deal with this domestic radical Islamic problem that we have in our country?
Because it's ideologically based, and the ideology is firmly rooted in the scriptures of Islam. And I think that people have been reluctant to draw the straight line nexus between the scriptures of Islam and violence committed by Islamic supremacists who are also violent jihadists. And it's really important that we get over that for a couple of reasons. Number one, you obviously can't protect the country. It's good law enforcement, good military practice, and good intelligence to know the enemy so that you can anticipate what the enemy is going to do. That's the only way that you can protect yourself. So we need it for national security purposes. We also need it in terms of identifying who the enemy combatants are. The authorization for military force that we're operating under is now 12 years old. It has never been amended to bring it into line with the current reality of the war. And the war now transcends 9/11. It transcends Al-Qaeda and the Taliban.
Yeah.
The thing that makes it logical is this ideology that drives the jihadist violence against America. And we really, I think, need to have an authorization of force and an enemy combatant law that reflects exactly who the enemy is.
I just got about a minute and a half to go. Do you really believe that this comes down to a case of, our continually trying to make us and our culture relative to everyone else and not, admitting to the fact that there is a difference, there is this ideological separation, an ideological separation that has infiltrated into our country?
Yeah, I think that we have never, in the 20 years I've been at this, and this goes back to the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, we have never gotten into the enemy's head. We've always basically imposed our own views and our own values on them. And the problem is that they neither conduct themselves according to our values, nor do they judge themselves by, whether we approve or disapprove. In fact, our disapproval is in many ways something that they would regard as increasing their self-esteem. So unless we get to the intelligence point where we can see the world like they do, I don't see how we defend ourselves from them.
Well, it's amazing because when you go back and you look at the explanatory memorandum that was uncovered in 1991 during an FBI raid in Northern Virginia, it lays out the strategic blueprint for radical Islamists here in the United States of America, and it was written by the Muslim Brotherhood. Why are we not talking about that strategic plan more so? And what can we do to bring that out to the American people?
Yeah, I think the big problem that the administration has, Colonel, and it's a problem for the whole country since they're responsible for protecting us, is that the Muslim Brotherhood organizations they want to cultivate as allies, at the end of the day, have exactly the same ideology as Al-Qaeda, which is the only jihadist organization that they're willing to hang the terrorist label on. And as long as they continue to cultivate people who mean harm to the United States, we're going to run into exactly the problem that you're outlining.
Well, I tell you, Andrew, we have got to stop so narrowly defining this enemy to, as you say, just Al-Qaeda or Taliban, because you have Hamas, Hezbollah, Islamic Jihad, just a whole panoply of organizations out there that are really standing against us. So I want to thank you so much for taking the time to be with us, Andrew, and continue your fight to make sure that maybe this will never happen again, but we need your voice out there.
Thanks so much, Alan. I appreciate it.
You got it. And you can read more of Andrew's work at pjmedia.com or pick up his latest book, Spring Fever, The Illusion of Islamic Democracy. For Next Generation TV, I'm Alan West, and thanks for watching.